Hello and welcome to a brand new Mind Mastery video. Today I'm going to talk about the child archetype and its related subtypes as described by Christine Mayes. And also I'm going to try to provide some tips on how we can use its energy, its balance form in our everyday life for personality growth, for enhancing our lives and our experience of life. So the child archetype is associated with this kind of light-hearted energy. So seeing wonders in our lives, seeing magic in our lives and ourselves and other people. And Jung recognized the importance of the child archetype in the process of individuation and our personality growth, because the child archetype represents this beginning of our development. So it is strongly connected with our past and where we are coming from. So it's like in a sense, like a foundation of who we are, because in childhood, that's where the most development and growth happens. That's all these experiences in childhood influence who we will be as a person in the adulthood, how we will see life, right? So most importantly, there is this connection between the child archetype and how we perceive life. So kind of how we interpret what is happening to us, how we interpret other people, and general dynamics of life. So it's sort of like lenses that we use to perceive life itself. And there are many different subtypes of the child archetype, such as the wounded child or the divine child. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first briefly describe the basic dynamics of the child archetype, then its shadow aspect, of course, and then I'm going to move on to the subtypes, because we all have these different subtypes within us, but usually for an individual, there's one or two subtypes that are most prominent, most emphasized, and have the most influence over our perception. And lastly, I'm going to try to provide some tips on how we can use this balanced form of the child's archetype in our everyday life so that we can see more in life, experience more, and also live sort of a more balanced life by creating this balance between our adult self and the child self. So I did cover already most of the characteristics of the child archetype, which deals with this light-hearted energy, so playfulness, seeing wonders in our life, seeing magic, right? But the primary dynamic of the child archetype is dealing with the conflict between dependency and responsibility. So how much dependency should we allow in our lives, and how much responsibility? How much should we be dependent on other people? And how much responsibility we should take for our own actions and our own feelings. And that also kind of connects to this issue with authority, right? So how much should we rely on the authority? How much should we follow the rules, other people, for example? And how much should we go against it and be independent and choose our own path? So these are the underlying dynamics for the child archetype that are prominent for all subtypes, right? This is like a general idea of these energies from this archetype. And in a general sense, the shadow aspect of the child archetype arises when we go too much into the child, right? So that at some point there is a clash between our ideas, values, and the reality. So, we can feel like a sense of unfairness, that the world isn't meeting our expectations. The world is cruel. The world is unfair, right? Because we went too far into this child archetype and this idealistic fantasy land. So as a consequence, we might feel this despair, throwing tantrums, right? Being overly dependent on other people and looking for comfort in things that might not really bring us comfort. So kind of clinging to other people, being very needy, and generally avoiding responsibility for our own feelings, our needs, our actions, but kind of pushing this responsibility onto other people, in a sense, so being overly dependent. Other negative aspects of the child archetype include this immaturity, not taking life seriously, right? Being overly impulsive, spontaneous, right? Chaotic, living in this la-la land that is completely disconnected from the reality, right? And lastly, there might be some conflicts with the authority. So we might even be overly dependent on the authority. So following it precisely, following rules precisely, and just being very, very good child in a sense, but compromising our individuality. Or we might go into the opposite end where we rebel against everything, right? So we might go against the rules, right? Just for the sake of rebelling, just for the sake of kind of proving the point that we will not follow the authority at all. And the last possible negative element of the child archetype is connected with being naive, right? So overly trusting everyone, not being able to distinguish between the right and wrong kind of behaviors or people, right? So just going along with the flow and being naive, as in kind of seeing life as, all right, everything's going to be fine, everything's fine, but in the reality we are actually avoiding taking that responsibility. Now, there are several subtypes of the child archetype, so I'm going to cover each of them briefly before moving to practical tips. Now, the first subtype is the wounded child. So the wounded child is all about carrying this wound from childhood and seeing life, perceiving life through this wound. So we might feel easily hurt. We might have certain triggers within us that prevent us from doing certain things in our life, prevent us from taking action or connecting with other people. So this archetype comes from our childhood. So we probably went through some painful experiences, traumatic experiences, which then influence how we see life, right? So in a negative aspect, we're going to be blaming other people for our pains. We're going to be seeing other people as our enemies who try to hurt us all the time. And we also might have this tendency for self-pity or being overly dependent on other people for solving our problems in a sense. So that's the negative aspect if we are not if we haven't done enough healing on that child archetype. The positive one is because we are having this wound, because we are using this wound to perceive life as it is, that enables us to connect with other people, to be compassionate towards others who went through similar experiences, right? And in order to use the balanced form of this archetype, we need to be able to transcend our pain so that we can heal it, so that we can take responsibility for it. So in a sense, it's like a dynamic between the adult and the child self, where the adult take care of the child, so that, all right, we acknowledge the wound, right? We acknowledge our pain, we acknowledge our feelings, but we are able to transcend it. So this process of transcending our wound is actually the process of self-empowerment, because that's where we're going to draw our self-esteem from. We can't draw self-esteem from, being immersed by pain, but only by overcoming it. And also this process can enable us to improve our ability to help other people, to connect with them on this more mature level rather than through our wounds. Now, the next subtype is that of the orphan. Now, the orphan child is coming from our experiences where we didn't feel like we belong. So perhaps we didn't feel compatible in a sense with our family. We felt like maybe we felt abandoned even, where we couldn't relate to our parents, we couldn't relate to our family. So as a result of that, the negative aspect of this subtype will be manifested through the feelings of abandonment, right? A lack of trust towards other people, overly relying on support groups, for example, who in adulthood serve us as a kind of surrogate family that we didn't have as children. And the positive aspect, in contrast, relates to our ability to be independent, to rely on ourselves, to make conscious choices in life, to choose our own values, to choose our own path without feeling the need to consult with other people. And the lesson, or the way how we can balance this archetype, is all about learning interdependence. So how we can be dependent on other people, but at the same time keep our independence, because that's how we create relationships, right? When you are in a close relationship, this dynamic is like back and forth. So sometimes you are a little bit dependent on the other person, but also you can be independent once that person is gone. So it's all about having this ability to connect with other people on this mature level without going into extremes of being overly dependent or independent. The next subtype is called the innocent child. And the innocent child is all about seeing beauty in everything. It's all about imagination and kind of having all these ideas about ourselves, the world in general, and feeling like we are living in this fantasy world in a sense. So we can see how the negative form of this archetype will be manifested as kind of completely spacing out into this unrealistic realm of fantasies and imagination, so that it's completely removed from the reality itself. And we can see that it can lead us into depression, for example, when we experience our ideals being completely crushed by the reality. Or we can even experience despair or existential anxiety because there is this huge gap between what we think that the reality is and what it actually is. The positive aspects in turn enable us to draw on the source of imagination and fantasy so that we can see more in our lives, right? And also being able to draw on our optimism, draw on our sense of beauty, to push through obstacles, right? To have the courage to move regardless of what the reality presents itself. So in order to balance these two aspects, the positive and the negative, so that we don't go into extremes too much and we don't get lost in this fantasy world, we need to be able to ground our perspectives in the reality. So, periodically engage in something called the reality check, right? Are our ideals realistic? Are we doing the realistic thing? Are our beliefs completely removed from the reality, or are they actually useful and practical? So we need to be able to ground ourselves and remain present with our optimism and desire to see beauty in everything. Now the fourth subtype on my list is called the nature child. And the nature child is all about feeling connected with all these natural laws, feeling connected with nature, with animals, and having this special relationship with animals that can enable us to kind of connect with this grounded energy of being a human being, right? Being part of the animal world. So the nature child is both the sensitive, right, and attuned to these natural laws, but also tough and resilient, because when you're in nature, it's not just about, seeing all the wonders and marvelous things in the natural and animal world, but also about being tough and being able to survive and defend yourself against various predators. So the negative aspect of this archetype, of this subtype, is our misuse of our toughness and misuse of our ability to defend ourselves, right? So this can manifest as abuse, as disregard for natural laws, right? Being overly aggressive or angry, right? And the positive one enables us to create this balance and harmony in our lives because we are following these natural laws, right? We are being grounded and present within this kind of basic human level of existence. So again, in order to balance this archetype, we need to be creating this harmony and balance between different forces in our lives, right? We need to be able to see not only the positive, the easygoing aspects of the nature, of animal world, of our humanity, but also the more negative ones, so that we can use them at appropriate times. Now the fifth subtype is called the eternal child, which is all about remaining eternally young. So enjoying life despite of your age, right? Enjoying various activities, regardless if you are 10 years old or 20 years old or 60 years old. This subtype is mostly associated with this idea of avoiding responsibility because you feel eternally young, right? If you feel eternally young as an eternal child, you're not going to feel this. You're not going to be having the sense of responsibility for your life, for your health, for your choices, but you will be just going with the flow because you can, right? Because you're a child, and that's allowed. But also that can lead you astray, where you again avoid the responsibility, introduce too much chaos in your life, and in this state where you are immature, you not only won't be able to develop your personality, because when you are overusing this child archetype, it's like being stuck on this developmental level of childhood where you can't move on to maturity, where you can't mature enough because your beliefs about doing whatever you want prevent you from taking that responsibility for your actions. So obviously, in order to balance this archetype, you need to be able to know when it's a time for play and when it's time for work. So obviously, you create this balance between work and play, responsibility and fun. The next aspect of the child archetype is called the dependent child, which, as the name suggests, is all about being dependent on other people. So not really creating life for ourselves, not really taking responsibility for our needs, not really engaging in self-care, but putting this responsibility onto other people. And it's also associated with having this sort of emptiness within us, so that regardless what we get from other people, it's never enough. We are never content with what we are having, so that we might appear as being needy. We might cling to other people. We might never feel satisfied with what we are having. And in order to balance this archetype, in order to balance these energies, we need to pay attention to when we become too self-absorbed with ourselves. We need to be able to meet our own needs and acknowledge when our needs are met, right? So we need to meet these needs appropriately. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to derive any satisfaction from what we are doing, from our self-care, or from what other people are doing for us. So again, paying attention to where we are becoming too self-absorbed, too selfish, too egocentric. And the central point here is, again, paying attention to our needs and meeting them in a consistent way. So learning how to care for ourselves. And the last subtype on my list is called the Divine Child. And the Divine Child, just as the name suggests, is all about kind of living in the space of divinity, of spirituality. So cultivating this innocence within us that comes from, in a sense, this divine realms or spiritual realms where we want to do the right thing, when we do the right thing, where we are kind of moral in a sense. So the images that come to my mind relate to, saints, for example, who live in the space of purity, so that there is no evil, there is no wrong things, there is no wrong people, there is no aggression, there is no anger, but it's all very nice and calm and divine in a sense. But there is a very strong negative element to this archetype, to the subtype, which relates to the fact that we push this shadow, all these shadow aspects of humanity out of our consciousness, so that where we do need to defend ourselves, when we do need to actually use our aggression and anger, it's not available to us because we strive towards this perfect morality, this perfect divinity, this perfect innocence, so that we can't really defend ourselves when the time comes. So the lesson here, or the way we can balance this archetype, is to acknowledge our shadow, so that we own our aggressive drives, we own what we perceive as evil behaviors or evil tendencies, and we own it, right? So that we can use it when it's appropriate. So based on all these subtypes and what I talked about, the child archetype in general on the beginning of the video, we can summarize the practical tips for balancing or for using the balanced form of the child archetype in our lives in a few points. The first one is obviously staying grounded and staying realistic. So obviously the energy of the child could be used for imagination, creativity, playfulness, and seeing the marvels and wonders of the world, but we need to be able to ground it in practical ways, so that our perspective is realistic, so that we see people for who they are. We see humanity, or a general human archetype, for what it is, right? We see the good in other people, but we are also acknowledging the evil, so that we'll create this realistic and grounded perspective where we develop sufficient self-awareness of our own drives. We can remain connected with the reality, right? We can remain connected with how the life truly is. So that kind of shields us from a potential disappointment or despair or depression, because we acknowledge, all right, that's how it is, how the life is. And, you know, for some people it might equal with some disappointment at first, or kind of feeling gutted, like, all right, maybe the world isn't as nice as I imagine it to be. But going through this process will allow you to ground your perspective in the realistic way, right? So that you can see life for what it is. Next, we need to be able to organize our lives so that there is a time for playfulness, right? We give our child a time to play, to be creative, to party, whatever you need to do, whatever your child needs to do. But also you need to be able to structure your life around responsibility, so that you take responsibility, so that you take care of your needs, so that you relate to other people on this mature level, not through fantasy world, not through your ideals, not through your expectations of how people should be, but through how people actually are, right? How the world actually is. So taking responsibility for your actions, for your needs, for your emotional being, so that when you relate to other people, it's on the mature level of interdependence, not dependence, not independence, not these extreme ways of dealing with different human dynamics, but through interdependence, where both people are equal. And lastly, as a reminder, an important element of taking care of our child is actually learning various habits of self-care. So how do you process your emotions? How do you make sure that your health is good? How do you make sure that your habits are centered around your well-being, for example, right? So all these different ideas point to a fact that we simply need to be able to care for our inner child, in a sense, to take care of our needs, to take care of our desires, whatever our child needs in that moment, right? So this has my take on the child archetype. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thank you very much for watching.